うん。寝てるとか動かない。はぁ。ショッケー。では始めましょう。コープイン JavaScript の再開と。
The next topic we need to get into is the way scope works in JavaScript. And this is an important thing to understand. Because in JavaScript, when JavaScript was originally written, you have to keep in mind that they really thought that it was going to be very short scripts that were used on web pages to do some interactive things, and that was about it. They didn't expect JavaScript to become a general all-purpose programming language at that point. So scope was not really very big of a concern. But JavaScript has become a general programming language, and scope is now a pretty big concern, and we need to be careful about it. And this is another thing in the language that is potentially problematic and that you want to be really clear about and have some best practices around so you don't make mistakes and get unexpected results and spend a lot of time chasing down bugs in your code, because that's no fun. So let's talk about how scope works. If we look at this script over here, and I'm actually going to switch to my code editor over here because I have this written over here. I have a variable called a variable, and it's in the global scope. It's not defined, it's defined within the script tag, but it's not defined within any sort of function. And then I have a variable also called a variable in the local scope. And then I'm going to run test scope, this function here, which should print out this variable. And then I'm going to console log out a variable, which should print out that variable. Let's see if that actually works. I'm going to open a new tab here and do Control O and open up scope and click open. And we get that. And I'm going to do inspect. And I'm going to move this thing down to the bottom and click on console. And you can see this is in the local scope and this is in the global scope. So I have two variables with the same name with two different values. And that's kind of bad. It's not really a great thing to have happen there. But you can do that kind of thing with JavaScript. And it's not great. So what does local scope mean? Well, let's do this for a second. Let's go ahead and take this out of here and then run that file again. Now, this one's running because it's inside the local scope, but the one that says this says a variable is not defined. Because what happens here is that I cannot access, if this variable doesn't, a variable doesn't exist, I can't access this one from outside this function because this variable is only accessible within inside the scope of this function. And so that's what local scope means, is that it's local to inside the function and I can't access it outside the function. And that can be very important for making sure that we don't have problems with our variables. Okay, great. Even worse, this is what happens when things get even worse. In JavaScript, and we've seen this before, is if I make a variable and I forget to use the var keyword, that variable automatically becomes part of the global scope. So I'm going to go ahead and add this in here and see what happens. I'm going to make another variable called oops global, but I'm not going to use the var keyword equals, quote, this is accidentally global. And then down here, you'll notice I can access that variable, even though it's defined, kind of defined, because I didn't use the var keyword. It's not really defined inside the function. It belongs to the window. So now you'll notice when I run this over here, this one runs. So I couldn't access the local scope variable because it was inside the function, but because I forgot to use the var keyword here, if I put var in front of this, that will no longer be global and we'll get that error happening again. So this is kind of a bad thing in JavaScript, is that you could accidentally leave out var, just a keyword, and the variable will still be defined, but it'll be defined at the wrong scope level, and that could lead to all kinds of problems.
ということは、tell statements about the global base. JavaScript was written in either scope was never going to be a problem. Visual Smart is reliable in the global scope. なもんかな？違う。
One strategy that we can use to deal with the global scope and trying to prevent problems there is to just never use the global scope whenever possible. So here you can see I have a very simple script that is doing what we've done before. It's going into our document, getting our paragraphs, and then using a loop to change all the color for each paragraph to red in that loop one at a time. It's going through and looping that. But here, my P's is in the global scope, the variable I is in the global scope, all of this stuff is in the global scope. So that could be problematic. So what can we do about that to keep it out of the global scope? One thing we can do is we can use what's called an IIFE, or an immediately invoked function expression. Basically, we wrap all of that stuff inside of a function that will just run automatically when the page loads. So we could take all our scripts and stick it inside of one of these sort of self-running functions, and it will just run and do its thing inside the function. And it'll keep the variables local to that function. So let's take a look at how to do this really quickly. Over here, I have my script, and you can see that I'm getting my paragraphs, and I've got my for loop here, and it's going through and doing that. And then if I come back here and actually run this thing, you can see that it's actually turning these paragraphs red. So that's all working and working as expected. The way to use the IIFE, the immediately invoked function expression, is like this. We type a set of parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, we put a function, which has its own parentheses and its own curly braces. And then we add one more set of parentheses to force it to run. And we can put a semicolon at the end of that. And then when we click in here, we can actually take this entire thing and stick it inside of that function. There we go. And now that function will run when the page loads. So if I come over and refresh it, you'll see it just runs and it works just the same as before. But what's different now is that these variables are now local to this function and they're not in the global space. So down here, if I do console.log my P's, I'm going to get an error, which is what I want. I want to make sure that I cannot access the variable in the global scope. So if I do that and then come back over here and run this again, it'll run fine. But if I inspect, you'll see in the console, I'm getting an error. My P's is not defined because it's not in the global scope. So again, I'm going to do that one more time because the syntax is just terrible, but it really is helpful for making sure everything stays in the local scope there of this function. So I'm going to get rid of that again. And I'm going to just do this one more time. So we start with a pair of parentheses, and in there we add a function with its parentheses and its curly braces. And then to make it run immediately, we put another set of parentheses like that. And I'm going to just put a semicolon. And then this is what's going to hold all our code. So we put that in between the curly braces, move that down, and then all of this stuff can just go inside here. Like so. And once you've typed this function expression a few times, you'll get comfortable with it. And then that will work just fine. And it keeps everything local to this function expression. There are a few more things that I want to say about this while we're here. This is also called namespacing because we are making sure that the space for the name for this variable is set so that it's within this function. So that's actually a namespacing thing. And namespacing has to do with where things are available. Another thing to point out is that any function in JavaScript is a closure, really. All functions are closures. Anything that you put inside of a function is going to keep those variables from creeping out into the global scope, unless you forget the var keyword. And we'll get to a fix for that in a minute. But that's an important thing. And often when we talk about closures in JavaScript, if you look it up on YouTube, closures in JavaScript, although technically any function is a closure, really what people are talking about, usually when they're talking about closures, is not just keeping the variables local to the function, but also being able to get data out of those closures as well. And we're not talking about that part at this point. We'll deal with that in a more advanced course. But here, we're just looking at how do we keep the variables inside the closure for this particular function here. How do we keep it inside there so that it doesn't pollute the global scope? And that's the terminology that we use, polluting the global scope. And one reason why we don't want to pollute the global scope is we could be combining scripts from other people, and they could have variables with the same names, and then these variables could collide with each other and you could get unexpected results because you think a variable is holding one value, but in fact it's holding another because it's coming from another script because they didn't keep their variable values local and they let them creep into the global scope. Those are some of the problems that you can run into with more complex scripts. So there's that. One last thing I want to go over really quickly here about the immediately invoked function expressions is we can make a function. Here I have my doStuff function back again, and I can call it this way with doStuff. But any function can be immediately invoked. So if I comment out doStuff here, that's not going to do anything. It's just going to define the function. But I could put a parenthesis in front of this and a parenthesis at the end of it, and then a set of parentheses and a semicolon. And now that function will run. doStuff will run right off the bat without having to actually call it like this. So this is an immediately invoked function as well. So if I do that and then come over here, save that, and then come over here and test it, you'll see it runs just fine and it does everything it needs to do. However, we're using the anonymous function here, this anonymous function here, just as an anonymous function that will just automatically run. And I have that page open over here in the MDN for the IIFE, the immediately invoked function expression, which will explain more about how this works and what it does. It's kind of a useful technique that we have at our disposal. Okay, great. We'll look at the next thing in the next video. The first strategy was to use some sort of closure with namespacing to make sure that the variables stay out of the global scope. The second strategy is to use this useStrict directive. And this is something that came out as part of ES5 in 2009. Because it was recognized fairly early on that the issue of forgetting to use the var keyword in defining a variable is really very problematic, potentially very problematic. So we wanted to have that not happen. And let's take a look at how this works, because this is kind of interesting. So over here, I have a variable, and I didn't put var here like that. So I've left off the keyword. So this new var is going to get defined in the global scope. And it is in the global scope anyway, because we're not inside of a function, but that's okay. We can do this, and we can console log that out. And I can save that and go over and run it over here in my browser, and you'll see that that variable gets sent out to the console log as described there, which is fine. But if I add the useStrict directive in here, useStrict, like so. This is a directive. So we put that in there, and then watch what happens. If I come over and try to run this script again, uncut reference error, new var is not defined. So useStrict will keep me from accidentally forgetting the var keyword. If I put that in, it'll work just fine. There we go. Now, again, this was something that came out as part of ES5 back in 2009, and that's kind of a very interesting and useful tool to keep us from doing this. And if we combine these two things together, the IIFE or the closure, if we make sure that everything is enclosed inside of a function, and the useStrict directive, if we do those two things together, we'll be making really big progress towards making sure that our variables are staying within the proper scope for our functions and everything. So that's really great. And as you go forward with working with scripts, I strongly recommend that you use both of these two things. And I'm going to give you sort of an exercise that will help you with practicing this in just a few minutes. I just want to show you one more strategy that's going to help us with scope before we do that.
const ES6 ね。
The third strategy that will help us with keeping track of scope is to use const and let as keywords for defining variables instead of var. So const and let were introduced into the language. They were added to the language as part of ES6 or ES 2015. And they both help to minimize the chances that a variable holds an unexpected value. Const will hold a value, but once you've set the value for a variable, you cannot change the value of that variable while the script runs. So that will keep you from accidentally reassigning a value to a variable that has been defined using the const keyword. So here I've got const cheese equals yummy. And now that that's been set, while the script runs, it cannot be changed. The let keyword allows you to change the variable, but it has block level scope. So here, let I equals 0, that I is only available as a variable inside this for block, this for loop block, and it won't be available outside of the for loop block. So that adds a third level of scope to JavaScript. Previously, we had the global scope and we had scope inside functions, but we didn't have any block level scope. Now we've got a block level scope. Let's take a look at a couple of these examples. First, let's look at const. So here I have cheese equals yummy, and I can console log that out. But if I try to assign a different value to cheese, I'm going to get an error. Let's just see. I have that over here in my code editor here, and that's great. So we can try to run that. When I run that over here, what I get is uncut type error, assignment to constant variable. Cheese is yummy ran, that ran fine, but I could not assign a new value to that variable without getting an error. And that's going to keep me from accidentally assigning a new value to that variable when I don't want to, or I want to make sure it doesn't change. So that's going to really help. The next thing we can look at is the let keyword and using that instead of var. And we'll do this with a for loop. So let's go over to our code editor and put this one in really quickly. I'm going to just make a quick for loop here for. And instead of using var I, I'm going to use let I equals 0. Oops, 0, not O. Let I equals 0. While I is less than 10, something like that. Let's do it like that. There we go. I plus plus. And then curly braces console.log I. And if I test this, you'll see that I will get printed out 10 times. That's as expected. So that's working just the same way as as var. But if I come back here, if I try to do console.log, use my tick marks, the value of I is I, but make that a variable, $, curly brace, that's going to generate an error because I've used the let keyword and this has block level scope. Let's see that in action. I is not defined. Whereas if I were to come back here and change this keyword to var, that doesn't have block level scope. So if I save that, the value is 10, the whole loop and it got up to 10. So with var, we don't have block level scope, but with let, we do. So with our third strategy here, what we should do is never use var to define variables anymore. Instead, we can use const or let. And in general, use const whenever you can. Use const by default. And then if you actually have to have a variable change values, like you will in a loop, then you can use let. But mostly stick with const as much as possible.
What does this in JavaScript and not programming it? Use strict. この3つか。OK.
One last thing I want to talk about before we're done with talking about scope is hoisting in JavaScript. And this has to do with where variables and functions are defined. Generally speaking, functions and variables get hoisted in JavaScript, meaning JavaScript looks at the file and it sees that variables have been used, so it hoists them up to the top, as well as functions as well get hoisted up to the top. Let's see an example of this really quickly. So for example, if I use the var keyword to define cheese, but I console log cheese out first, see what happens. So over here in my code editor, I have console log cheese, and then I'm defining the variable after I'm running the console. Notice what I get over here. If I refresh this page, I get undefined because the variable has not been defined at the point at which I'm using it, but it knows it exists because of the hoisting. Whereas if I change that variable declaration there to const, watch what happens. Now I get an error. And you may be thinking, why would I want an error? Well, really, what we're trying to avoid is unexpected results. And if you can explicitly get an error that says that it didn't get called right, then that's better than getting something that's undefined or something that's unexpected. So in this case, even though we don't really want errors, it helps us identify problems in our scripts before they become big problems and bugs that are difficult to track down. Great. So with that, you've learned a lot about the scope in JavaScript and the different strategies for dealing with scope in JavaScript. And they include, first and foremost, using some sort of closure or namespacing with the immediately invoked function expression to keep variables out of the global scope. That's number one. Number two, use the use strict declaration to do that and keep that going. And then number three, or the use strict will keep us from having variables that are accidentally declared without using the var keyword or any keyword from going into the global scope. And then number three, use const and let as keywords to define variables. Those three strategies together will really help with making sure your scripts are more bulletproof and less prone to bugs and mistakes. The scope techniques that we just discussed take some getting used to. So I really strongly recommend you do this exercise to help you get used to them and get comfortable with them. Previously, you had done some event challenges, and I have that folder over here. So I have a folder here with challenges 22 through 30, and hopefully you have those as well with all the completed challenges in there. If you don't, you should go do those challenges first. Then I have my code editor here. I'm going to open that folder in my code editor by clicking open folder, and I can open my event challenges folder here, and it will show up on the side over here. So that's great. Next, what I'm going to do is practice these best practices around scope and around some stuff around file management as well, and working with scripts and files. So here I have my challenge 22 challenge that I did with the script at the bottom of the page. What I want to do is I want to move the script off of the bottom of the page to a separate linked file, and I want to make use of my best practices around the immediately invoked function expression that runs automatically, as well as the use strict directive that will keep me from accidentally having variables that don't have a keyword starting them. And then I want to switch my keywords from var to either const or let wherever I possibly can. So let's do that. Over here, I'm going to make a new file, and you can click this button here to make a new file. This one makes a new folder, so be aware of the differences there. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call it script22.js to go with this, to go with challenge 22 here. And on script22.js, I'm going to start by adding my immediately invoked function expression by starting with the parentheses, and then I'm going to put in here a function with its parentheses and curly braces. And then don't forget, I need one more set of parentheses to make that actually run. Okay, so I've got a function here. And in here, I'm going to add the use strict directive. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to challenge 22 here, and I'm going to come down to the bottom, and I'm going to copy or cut. I can actually just cut Command X or Control X, cut this script right from here, and instead I'm going to paste it in here like that. Might have to Shift Tab to move that over. All right, great. So that's here. And maybe I don't need that part so much. That's fine. The next thing I want to do is replace any variable declarations so they're not using the var keyword. They're using either const or let. Use const wherever you possibly can, and use let where you have to. So this can be const, and this can be const. Why? Because I'm going into my document and getting these elements out of the document. That's not going to change during the running of the script. So that's all fine. So I've done my three things. I'm using my function expression here, my immediately invoked function expression as a closure, and then I'm using the use strict directive to, if I had forgotten to put const here, that will catch that problem and tell me explicitly that I've done a bad thing. And I've changed my variables declarations from using var to const. Now over here in my file, instead of having the script here, I'm going to add a source src equals, and then I can actually put in here script 22. And that's fine. I can move this up to here, really. So you have to keep the closing tag, but that will work. And now I can come over to my file in the browser over here, refresh, test it, and you can see it still works. It still functions just fine. Even more, if you want to, you could even take this even further by moving the declaration for the script here up to the top of the file. I can put it in here in the head, but I have to add the defer keyword here. With defer, it will make it run as if it's at the bottom of the page. And you'll see that still works. If I take defer out of here, watch what happens. And it doesn't work because add event listener of null. It's what's going on here is that the page loads from the top to the bottom. So it's loading the script first before it gets to the button. And on the script, it's saying, put an event listener on the button. Well, I can't put an event listener on a button that doesn't exist yet. But adding the defer keyword up here, what that does is it makes it so that it loads that script after the rest of the page is loaded. So that will work just fine. So you can go through the rest of these and you'll create a new file for script23.js. And you'll do the same thing on this one. On challenge 23, you'll notice that can be const, that can be const. This down here has to be let. That'll have to be let. Yeah. Go through and put in const and let wherever there's a var. Use const as much as you can, and only use let where the variable actually has to change. Here, we're using an incrementer that's going to change as we loop through this for loop, so it has to be let. But use const wherever you can. And if you do that and create all these files and do that repetition, here it's just 8 times. But even just doing that 8 times, you'll start to really get comfortable with this syntax of the immediately invoked function and the use strict, and you'll start to get used to using const and let instead of var for your keywords. And that will really help you out in the long run.
ここら辺は見たから。 学習用教材。クロージャー、IIF。眠。ここら辺は、これは歴史ですけど、ここから入るっていう。エシンクも、これ IIF があるからこういうのを使えるなと。そしてここ、ポジションを見ると、ほい、ほい。マイファイルですね。うん。別にいいのか。じゃあ、ここ終了としてマーク。そして、次の項目に、ZIP ファイルをダウンロードして、展開して、これ続けて、イメージ、これまで、分けることにして、ワークスペース、エデュケーションの、コーセラ、UC、モジュール3、K のスライド上、イメージする。で、インデックスシステムを入れて、これで OK と。で、ここは、合わせるオープンヒア。こう、ビジュアルスクリプトを起動と。で、こことこれを閉じて、ファイル、はい、フォルダーを開く。そうすると、モジュール1でなく、モジュール3のインデムスラッシュイメージ ですね。ここは、UML、インスト、インタライブサービス、ラストいらない。ラストエクステンションパック、ラストシンタックス。M ヘルパーもいらない。長いユーザーがいろいろだな。ES なので、これは有効にして、バイブサスは使わないから、何にして。これで、何これで終了としてる。次のコンプ。
Simple JavaScript slideshow demonstrating basic DOM manipulation and event handling. We've done a lot of the basics, and you've learned a lot about how JavaScript works and how you can manipulate the DOM and capture events. So now it's time to put together some scripts that are actually doing some interesting things and will allow us to test out what we know so far. If you look in the start files for this project, you'll notice there's some images and an index.html file. If you open up that index.html file in your code editor, you'll see that it's just got some very basic markup inside of it that includes a div with an image, one of the images in the folder, and a paragraph with two links, one for a previous link and one for a next link. And over here in my browser, I can see that it looks like this. When the user clicks the next link, it'll bring up the next picture. And when they click the previous link, it'll bring up the previous picture. And that's what we're going to make in this particular exercise here. There are lots of ways of going about creating this simple slideshow, but one way of doing it is to make a variable that includes an array, a variable which is an array, and it includes all of the images that we have in the folder. So let's start right there with that, because that's a really nice, simple place to start. And then what we're going to do is when the user clicks the link for next or previous, we're going to swap out the source attribute. We're going to swap out the value of the source attribute with a value from this array. So if we're getting if we'll start with getting image 0, which is image1.jpg, number 0 in the array. And then when you click next, we'll get image 1, which is this one here, which is actually image 2. So it's a little bit confusing because these are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're actually in the array 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But let's start by putting in the array into our script over here. So down here at the bottom of the page, just add script tags, like so. Script tags, and in the script tag we're going to add an array, var by images equals square brackets, and then each element goes inside quotes. It doesn't matter if they're single quotes or double quotes. It doesn't really matter. You can do it either way. Image1.jpg, comma, image2.jpg, and so on. We can actually put a comma here and just copy and paste. That's going to be image 3. And then we've got image 4. And finally, image 5. And the last one will not have a comma. It's important you take out that final comma. Image 5, and then a semicolon. That's our array. So there's our array, and that's going to go and get these images. And they're all in here in the folder. If we had a folder over here called images, you would just add that here. You could add images / and add the folder name in there. But we actually, in this case, with the files I gave you, I didn't create a folder for them. So they're just sitting here kind of at the root level of this folder. So that's great. We're all set with our array of images that describes all of the images that we have here. And next, we'll start working on how to actually capture the event of clicking the next button and then handling the swapping of the source attribute.
こういう風にか。とりあえず、
You will need some sort of variable that we can adjust along the way to capture which image that we're actually on in this array. So I'm going to make a variable called current image, and I'm going to set it to 0 because when the page loads, this image is showing, which is number 0 in the array. So images square bracket 0 would get that image. So let's set that over here. Let's make a variable here, var current image, and set that to a value of 0 to start with. So there we go. So that will help us with that. And then from there, we need to create an event handler that will handle the clicking for the next button. We'll do the.
ここの、あれです。削除です。もう一回コードで。これを、エクスプローラーで、オープン。待って。向こうの有効にするワークスペース。そうすると、文字列にこれが、オープンプレビューを開いた。で、ここで、デバッグコンソールはダメか。よし。行きましょう。クリプト。タイプ。コール。テキストの JavaScript。イメージ。コール。イメージ。JPEG。イメージ 2.jpeg。イメージ 3.jpeg。イメージ 4.jpeg。イメージ 5.jpeg。ってことする。同じようにレタレントイメージコール0で、コンストディスプレイイメージ。ロジャーをされていいような気がする。カッコ、ファンクション。カッコ、インデックス。レッド、イメージコール、イメージ、フラッシュ、フラッシュ、コント、 イコールクエリA。回答がVS コードシンタックス。無効にして有効なパークスペース。有効に有効にする。これいいでしょ。これすると、うん。クエリセレクター、カッコのシャープイメージ。img10。なんだっけ。ベンドスタイル違う。この場合どれだ？クライアントリストかすね。違う。はい。インナー HTML？ 違うな。img 点。この場合、D、アトリビュート、ビュート点、カレントイメージ、イコール、イメージ、イメージズ、スラッシュ、プラスの、はい、これでいいのかな？で、とりあえず、スープ、イメージ。うん。イメージ。カッコ3、カッコとすれば、画像が変わるはず。これで、イメージが、これに変わりたいんだよね。ちょっと待って。プレビューじゃなくて、じゃあ、エクスプローラーで表示して、 スクリプトを読んでくれない。そうすると、これがスコエラーかな。ディスプレイイメージ3や外して、つまり、あそこがおかしいっていう。S、R、コンスト、img 点、ここビデオの方見よ
You will need some sort of variable that we can adjust along the way to capture which image that we're actually on in this array. So I'm going to make a variable called current image, and I'm going to set it to 0 because when the page loads, this image is showing, which is number 0 in the array. So images square bracket 0 would get that image. So let's set that over here. Let's make a variable here, var current image, and set that to a value of 0 to start with. So there we go. So that will help us with that. And then from there, we need to create an event handler that will handle the clicking for the next button. We'll do the next link first. This is what it'll look like. Document get element by ID next. So it's going to go into our document and find that link that has the ID set to next. And I'm using the onClick special event property. And I'm going to run a function called next photo. Notice it doesn't have parentheses at the end of it, but I'm going to assign it a function called next photo. So then I can create that function next photo. So let's go ahead and add this to our script. Document get element by ID. Make sure it's always a good idea to pick it from the list so you don't spell it wrong. You have to get the capitalization right. Next. So that's going to go in here and look for this link here that has the ID of next. It's going to go into our document, look for that. OnClick equals next photo, semicolon. And then down here, we're going to make a function called next photo. Like so. There we go. Notice that if we look at this image tag here, it has an ID called, that has a value set to my image. So that's what we want to get. And we want to change the source attribute on that image if this button has been clicked. Also, what we want to do is we want to take current image here and increment it. So I'm going to do that first. I'm going to say current image plus plus. And remember, that's the same as saying current image equals current image plus 1. Doing current image plus plus is just a shortcut for taking current image, adding 1 to it, and assigning it back. Current image plus plus. So that's just a shortcut. Okay, great. So now I'm going to say, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say, okay, I need to go to document dot get element by ID. What ID do I want? I want my image up here, my image. And I want to set its dot source, src. My images, that array, current image. So that will go into this array here and find current image. Now, the first time I click that link, current image is going to get incremented to 1. So down here, that's 0, this is 1. So it says, okay, that's
image index. Here, this image 3カッコとできる。例えば、ここ2カッコというふうにできるはず。これをして、買った。さあ、あとは簡単。 と、レプ、こと、コール、ランク、はなし。9、カレントイメージ、マイナス。if、カレントイメージが0なら、カレントイメージイコールマイレングスディスプイメージ。カレント同じように、コンスト、ネクスト。他に時点値プラス。イメージ、大なり、イコール、マイ、イメージズ、レングス、イコール0と。あとは、ドキュメント、クエリーセレクター、プレビアス。オン、カット、ゲット、ペイメントバイ ID、オン、クリック、コール、プレップ、フォト、ゲット、はい、ネクスト、オン、クリック、コール、ポスト。待って、こっちはアット、イベントリスナー、音詞、L、クリック、コンマ、ネコ。だって、これで、ネクスト、ネクスト、ネクスト、ネクスト。もしかして、イメージ2、イメージ3、イメージ4、イメージ1、イメージ2、イメージ3。 イメージ、1、2、3、4、5。あ、最後も、コンマが邪魔だ。1、2、3、4、5。2がいいからもう切ってない。あ、ここピリオドになって、コマになってる。これでもう一回。2、2、3、OK。一応それでしょうっていうか、ここに基本までできた。じゃあ、あとは、
Simple JavaScript slideshow demonstrating basic DOM manipulation and event handling. We've done a lot of the basics, and you've learned a lot about how JavaScript works and how you can manipulate the DOM and capture events. So now it's time to put together some scripts that are actually doing some interesting things and will allow us to test out what we know so far. If you look in the start files for this project, you'll notice there's some images and an index.html file. If you open up that index.html file in your code editor, you'll see that it's just got some very basic markup inside of it that includes a div with an image, one of the images in the folder, and a paragraph with two links, one for a previous link and one for a next link. And over here in my browser, I can see that it looks like this. When the user clicks the next link, it'll bring up the next picture. And when they click the previous link, it'll bring up the previous picture. And that's what we're going to make in this particular exercise here. There are lots of ways of going about creating this simple slideshow, but one way of doing it is to make a variable that includes an array, a variable which is an array, and it includes all of the images that we have in the folder. So let's start right there with that, because that's a really nice, simple place to start. And then what we're going to do is when the user clicks the link for next or previous, we're going to swap out the source attribute. We're going to swap out the value of the source attribute with the value from this array. So if we're getting if we'll start with getting image 0, which is image1.jpg, number 0 in the array. And then when you click next, we'll get image 1, which is this one here, which is actually image 2. So it's a little bit confusing because these are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're actually in the array 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. But let's start by putting in the array into our script over here. So down here at the bottom of the page, just add script tags, like so. The last one will not have a comma. In this case, with the files I gave, the event of clicking and then handling the swapping. Is 1, so it says, okay, that's image2.jpg. So this is going to be image2.jpg, and I'm assigning that to this source attribute up here, the source. So instead of saying image1.jpg, it's going to say image2.jpg. Let's save that and see if that works. Come over here, refresh. If I click next, you can see that it's changed. And if I do inspect down here, let me arrange this the way I want it. I'm going to put this down at the bottom. I'm going to turn off that button there. But if I come in here and look at this div, notice the source says image2.jpg. If I click next again, notice that got changed to image 3. Image 4. Image 5. Oops, what happened? We got to image 5 because there are 5 images, and then I click next again, and now I have undefined. And you'll notice there's an error over here as well. So I can go to my console log and see undefined, error file not found. So it could not find, I've gotten beyond the end of my array. So at a certain point, it ceases to work, depending on how many pictures are in the array. So that's what we're going to fix next.
エラーを出してさせるのは基本のあれだね。なので
Let's think about this for a minute. What we want to do is we need some code that says if you're at the end of the array, go back to the beginning. Think about that for a minute. What do we know about JavaScript that will allow us to do this kind of thing? What logical flow control structure can we use to handle this? If you were thinking of something like this, you're on the right track. So if current image is greater than 4, because remember, the numbers in the array are 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if it gets greater than 4, if it becomes greater than 4, we can set current image back to 0 and then go and get the next image. So with this if statement in place, you can make the slideshow effectively loop around. So let's go ahead and add this. And it's just going to go in here, if, parentheses, curly braces. So in the parentheses, we want to say if current image is greater than 4. And it's kind of nice if you put some extra spaces in here, although not really necessary. If it's greater than 4, then the value of current image is going to get set back to 0. Current image equals 0. And we can just do this on one line. Sometimes you're likely to see it more like this, but like that perhaps. But this is such a short one-statement selection, if statement, that it kind of makes sense to just keep it on one line there. If current image is greater than 4, we can set that back to 0. Let's test that. I come over here and refresh this, and I click next. And down here in the elements, I'm going to come down and see in my div, you can see that that's image 2. Next, 3. Next, 4. 5. And then if I click next again, it should get set back to 0, which would get us image 1. And that works. So now the next button is looping around through all of the images that we have. That's great. Now it would be a little bit better if we could generalize our script a little bit. So rather than greater than 4 here, I know that it's 4 because I know it's 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I can use my length property to get that. I could do is less than myimages.length. That's not quite right yet because the length is 5. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 images in here. That's the length, right? So, but the images are numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we know that we want it to be 4. So it's myimages.length minus 1. And that may feel a little strange at first, but we'll be using this a lot when we're working with arrays. When we're working with arrays, the length of the array minus 1 is often what we want because arrays start counting at 0. 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So myimages.length minus 1 will give us a 4. And it's generalized so that if I were to add more pictures in here and add more pictures into the array, then the script would continue to function without having to go in and adjust the script as well. And wherever in programming we can do that to make it so that there are fewer adjustments in the future. If you change things, the better. That will make your script more general. So let's just test this just to be sure it still works. And sure enough, the page loads, and we've got in our body here, in our div, we've got image 1 here, and I can click next. I can click next all the way through, and it'll wrap around to the first one just fine. So that's great. Okay, next thing we need to do is handle the previous button. And maybe you can do that for yourself. It's always a great challenge. It's not that different than what we just did. It's a little bit different, but it's not that different. So you might be able to do the previous button by yourself.
相手のステートメントだったto avoid this mistake. 違う違う。It's using property to capture that event. It's using an array to store data needed to a script. はいと。開始。さあ次、プレイ。
To get started with the button for getting the previous photo, we first need a event handler that will go in and find that element with the ID of previous and add the onClick event property and run a function called previous photo. And then we can set up that function. So let's do that first. So up here, and you could even copy and paste this if you wanted to. Sometimes it's best to do that just to avoid making mistakes, but you have to be sure to change everything you need to change. So instead of next, this is previous. Instead of next photo is going to be previous photo. Okay, so now we've got our event handler, and now we need a function. Again, copy and paste, always good to make sure that the names match. Function, previous photo, parentheses, curly braces. There we go. Now the way to think about this, the previous photo button, you have to think backwards. And the easiest way to do it is to think about what happens if you're on the last photo. Suppose we're showing on the screen image 5, and current image is currently set to 4. What do we want to have happen when we click the button previous photo? We want current image to decrement. We want it to go from 4 to 3, and then we want to go in and get this image. And then when we click it again, it goes from 3 to 2, we get that image. And then it goes from 2 to 1, and we get that image. And then it goes from 1 to 0, and we get that image, so 0 is okay. If you click it again, if we don't do some sort of if statement, it's going to go from 0 to -1, and that's not going to work. So if the value of current image is less than 0, if it's less than 0, we want to set it to what? Well, we could set it to 4. That would work. Or we could set it to myimages.length -1, right? Let's take this piece by piece. Let's do this part first. I'm going to decrement current image. Current image.
マイナスマイナス。
Oops. Minus minus. That will decrement it. That's the same as saying
これで
current
0 以
image
下の
equals current image minus 1.
それで
So we're
小
going
さ
to
い場合は
decrement current image.
こんなも
And
の
then
だ
we
か
can
ら
do this again. If we leave off the if statement altogether, you'll see when we get down to the bottom of the images, we're going to have an error. But let's just do it just to see how that happens and what that looks like. So over here, I can refresh this, and I'm going to click next until I get to the end, to the fifth photo here. Oops. Div. So I'm on 4. One more. So now I'm on 5. And now I can click previous, and it'll go to 4. It'll go to 3. It'll go to 2. It'll go to 1. And now if I click it again, it's going to have an error because current image is going to be minus 1, and that's not going to work. Okay, undefined. So that's where we need our if statement. So let's come back here and see if we can write that if statement. It's going to look like this, so I might as well copy this one and paste it in here. But instead of current image is greater than my images, what I'm really looking for is current image less than, is it less than 0? Is current image less than 0? And if it is, I could set current image to 4, and that would work because that puts it back at the end of the array. That'll work just fine. But even better is to use the myimages.length minus 1. Again, to keep the script generalized. Myimages length minus 1. So now you'll see if I do this, I'm going to come back here, refresh the page, and again, I'll go back up to the end of the list here. There's 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now if I click previous, it should go to 4, and then to 3, and then to 2, and then to 1. And now if I click it again, current image is now going to be minus 1. That's less than 0. That's going to kick off that if statement and say, all right, it's less than 0. So it's going to set it to the end of the array. And there it is. There's 5 again. Because current image is 4, which is getting image 5 from the array. So now I can loop through in either direction. I can loop through going frontwards, and I can loop through going backwards.
まあ、自分のところもここやったから、次、その次にしましょう。
Everything is working. So now all we need to do is clean up the script just a little bit, make it a little bit better. And one way of doing that is to put it in a separate script file. For this script, it's short enough. You could leave it at the bottom of the page if you want to. But just to practice our best practices, let's move this script into a linked file. So over here, I could make a new file and call it script.js. And on this file, I could put my function expression that will be immediately invoked. So we do that with parentheses, and then in the parentheses we put in function with its parentheses and its curly braces, and then one more set of parentheses and a semicolon. Terrible syntax, but this will run when the script runs, when the script loads. It's an immediately invoked function expression. And it will keep us from having any variables in the global scope, which is always to our benefit. Because if you wanted to include this script on a web page with other things, perhaps you've got other things going on the web page, perhaps you've got other JavaScript elements going on the web page. You don't want current image to conflict with some other current image variable for some other script. So we want to keep everything inside of this function. So I'm going to click between here, and I'm going to also add my use strict directive. And then in here, I can just paste my entire script from here. And there it is. Shift tab to move that back. And even better would be to replace these variables with const. They're not going to change. Well, actually, this one is current image. That one's going to change. That one needs to be left because current image is going to get reassigned as we go through our scripts down here. But these variables will now be local to this function, and they won't be available at the global scope. So that kind of keeps everything nice and tidy in the script here. All right, over here, I'm going to remove that stuff, and instead up here, just link src equals script.js. Even pops up there in my menu. And I still need this closing tag, but I can move it up there. And that should work just as well. We should go back and test it and make sure that we didn't make any mistakes in the process of moving stuff around. And you can see that it still works just exactly the same as before. Now, we could leave the script here at the bottom of the page. There's nothing wrong with that. And frequently, I leave my scripts there. But even better is to move it up into the head of the page and add a defer attribute here. That will make the script load after the rest of the page is loaded. And it keeps it out of the body of my HTML, which I really want to keep my HTML as clean as possible so it's easy to read, easy to understand, easy to update, easy for Google to crawl, all of those reasons. I want to keep my HTML as clean as I possibly can without any extra attributes, without any extra code or anything else. But once I've got that all in there and working well, I should always come back and just test and make sure I did it right. Next, previous, and that's working just fine. So with that, we have a really nice script that's all set up and working well. And in this lesson, we've combined a lot of the basics that you've learned in the course. We're using some control structures, such as the sequence and the selection. We don't have a loop in this one, but we're using sequence and selection. We're using custom functions. We've got event listeners. When those event listeners trigger, we're affecting the DOM to change the web page. So all of these things are going on. Now, what you could do to make the script even better, perhaps, or just to test what you know so far, is go back to the script. And how could you replace using the onClick event handler with using the add event handler method instead? And I recommend giving that a try, because that's a really good challenge to see if you can figure out something on your own without making it too hard, without going too far. So see if you can do that, because that will really be to your advantage. Okay, great. Great job putting this together, and we'll see you in the next lesson. Everything is...
までいったから、じゃあディスカッションのプロンプト。今のこのコードに、きれいにしましょうか。新規、新しいファイル。で、インデックスね。SR でいこう。AS のディファー。で、ここ、こっちに、そうするとこのスクリプトいらない。そして、ここに、ダルコードに来んないけんのか、やっぱし。で、ここに IIF をやるから、で、最後に実行するから、実行用の括弧をつける。まあ、これで一応、動いてるからいいってことにしよう。で、OK と。まあ、ここのうちにプレイヤー。して、3周目スライドショー。クロスウェイドエフェクト。 アドバンストスライドしよう。クロスフェード。クロスフェード、今ダウンロードしたから、これも同じように展開して、CSS はファイル。ここに K の JS でいこう。そして、これでやっといて、ちょっと、閉じて、JavaScript モジュール3、クロスフェード、インデックスと CSS のスタイル CSS。フォーマットドキュメント。で、ここに新しいファイルを入れる。そして、インデックス HTML は、に、スクリプト SRC 交代 JS スラン JS と。で、リファ見るとこう。じゃあ続けて、アドバンストはだから終了として次。
Slideshow with crossfade effect, JavaScript with CSS animation. For this version of the slideshow, we're going to do something very similar to what we did before, but with a little bit of a twist. It's going to be a little bit more sophisticated. And I've got a little styling in here to make the slideshow look a little bit better. But instead of just swapping out the source, we'll have a crossfade effect as we go from one slide to the next. And we'll be using CSS to do that animation. So it's going to be a little bit different than what we did before, but very similar otherwise. The HTML for this slide deck, for this slideshow, is very similar to what we had before. We just have images, but now I have a folder called slides. So image source slide, image 1, and then I've got an alt tag and the ID for the image here, and then I've got my next and previous links as I had before. And you can see that over here in my HTML. So very simple setup with an image inside of a div called content. One thing that's different is that this time I'm using CSS to tell that content to be position relative. And I'm absolutely positioning these slides inside of here. So this content is set to 400 by 266 pixels, which is the exact size of the images that I have. And over here, you can see it here on the page. Now, if I were to go into my CSS over here and adjust that, you'd see a little bit better exactly what's going on here. So if I made this 500 wide instead of 400 wide and 366 instead of 266 and save that, you'd see over here when I refresh this that the image is
まあ、
pinned
本当にスタイ
to
ルだ
this
けだ
upper
な。
left-hand corner, and before it was the same size as the box that it was in. Whereas now I've made the box bigger, so you get this empty space up here, but the image is pinned up into the corner. And it's important to understand that because the way the slideshow is going to work is we're going to put a new image right on top of the old image, and then we're going to put it in fully transparent, and then we'll fade it in so that you'll get that crossfade effect. But you can see the image here is position absolute, left 0, top 0. So that's what's putting that image inside this parent element, this container, at the top left corner, left 0, top 0. And that's what's going on there. So we can put these back because that's just for demo. And you'll see if I refresh this, that the image is now once again fitting inside that box perfectly. So it's important to understand that setup before we start with this. The next thing we need is the actual CSS animation that's going to actually do the crossfade effect. So we need to add this to the style sheet. So go back to Visual Studio Code, and on the styles down here at the bottom, we can add these animation styles. So I'm going to add a class called fade in img, fade in image, fade in image. And what is that class going to do? It's going to come over here and see here. We're going to run an animation called fade in over 2 seconds. 2 seconds is kind of slow. You can make it 1 second. You can make it even slower. I'm making it kind of slow so you can really see it. See it taking effect as we do this. But you could make it run a little bit faster. Animation. And then we want to do fade in over 2 seconds. And that's fine. And then down here, we're going to have a function that will allow us to fade it in, an at keyframes function called fade in. So these two names have to match. So we'll add at keyframes, fade in, and then we're going to go from opacity 0. So we'll do, I forgot, from opacity 0 to opacity 1. So it's a very simple animation. You can make much more complex animations using this. Fade in from opacity 0 to opacity 1. Okay, great. Make sure you save this file. It's got the dot up here, so make sure you save the file so you've saved that. And make sure you have this in here correctly, because when we add an image on top of the other one, we're going to add this class to it, and then this class is going to run this fade in, at keyframes fade in here, which will start at 0 and then go to 1. So it'll come in at completely transparent and then fade into 1, which is completely opaque, over 2 seconds. And that's what's going to actually create that crossfade effect. So none of this is being done in JavaScript itself. And that's actually great because you can do this kind of thing in JavaScript, but it's much more efficient to do it in CSS. If you do it in CSS, then you can take advantage, the browser will take advantage of the GPU, the graphics processing unit of whatever computer or device you're using. Whereas if you do it in plain JavaScript, it's just the normal CPU, and the GPU is really optimized to handle this kind of thing. So it'll be nice and smooth and work much better if we can do the actual animation in CSS. And we're frequently going to do that with JavaScript, where we use JavaScript to trigger CSS animations. And although we can do the animations directly in JavaScript, whenever we can use it to trigger CSS animations, it's better for performance across all kinds of devices.
まずは、表示用にスタイルを作る。
Slideshow with crossfade effect. JavaScript with CSS animation.
で、コードの方では、スタイルシート。キーボード、フェードイン、イメージ。アニメーションが、アニメーション、フェードイン。フェードインっていうアニメーションを2秒間かけてやると。で、アットキーフレーム、フェードイン。フロム、オペーク、0から、まずオペーシティ、
Now we're all set up and ready to go and ready to start writing our script. And our script is going to start with just a basic variable, again, for our current image and our array, same array that we had before, same current image variables. And then I've got variables for the container, which is going to go get that container that's holding our image, and then for the next and previous buttons as well. So let's go ahead and get these set up in our script. So going back to our index file here, I'm just going to add script tag.
これはもうスクリプトやってるから、自分の方ではスクリプトです。のバンクの多くコンストイコール、この場合はスライドのイメージ1.jpg、イメージ 2.jpg、イメージ 3.jpg、イメージ4、イメージと、インデックスのこの辺を全部イメージイコール0で、エレメント。イメージイコールEL イメージこう。ゲット。まあ、これ分かればいいからね。マイイメージ。コンストプレポト。イコール。ここはクエリセレクター使うか。こういう風にやった方が、クエリセレクターのと、シャープ、プレビアス。コンスト。ネクスト。あとは、コール、ドキュメント。クエリセレクターで、ネクスト。ついでにこれによるとコンテナが必要になるので、イコール、ドキュメント、 クエリセレクター。コンテント。なんかな。そして戻ろう。
At the bottom of our script here, our HTML script, like so. And then I'm going to add var current image, and I'm going to set that to a value of 0 initially. And then I'm going to have var
は使わねえよ。
2. I want to make sure I match the same name that I had over here. I called it my photos. This time I used a lowercase p, so make sure you watch out for that. If you want to make it match my slides, my photos equals, doesn't matter if it's a lowercase p or an uppercase p, but you want to make it match. And as before, we're going to have our array, image1.jpg, comma, space, and then I'm just going to copy this. And again, it doesn't matter if you use single quotes or double quotes.
5まで入れるか。
Probably best if you're consistent, but it doesn't really matter. 3, 4, and 5. And remember, for the last one, you don't have a comma. So you want to get rid of that comma, but add a semicolon after this array here. A lot of times when students are typing these at first, they forget that each one of these needs to be inside a set of quotes. So make sure that you've got each one of these inside a set of quotes followed by a comma. You can't just add a quote here and a quote at the end and then put them all in there with commas. You have to have each one is inside of a set of quotes. Okay, so we've got that. And then the next thing we need are to get some variables, var container equals document dot get element by ID. And the ID that we're getting, again, is this one, content. And it's always good to copy and paste so that you don't spell that wrong. So that's going to get us that element. We also need the next and previous links, var next btn equals document dot get element by ID. Next, var prev btn equals document dot get element by ID. Previous. So again, that's going to go into our document. We're going to get our next button, we're going to get our previous button, and we're going to get our content div that we're going to be putting into these elements here. And I have an extra space there that I shouldn't have. Make sure you fix that if you have that in there. Okay, document get element by ID, content, next, and previous. Great, so we've got all of that. In the next video, we'll add the event listener for when you click on this next link here to go to the next slide. And just like we did before, we'll build out the next one, and then when we're done with that, when we get that all working, we'll work on the previous one. So we'll go ahead and work on that one first.
インサイトちゃんとできればあったら、やってきたからね。時みたい。
Okay, here's our event listener for when we click on the next button. And for this one, we're using the add event listener method instead of the onClick property. So we'll look at this method and add the event listener right to that next button variable that we created. And when it's clicked, we're going to run a function. This is an anonymous inline function, and we're going to pass in the event object so that we can prevent when you click the link. So we don't want the browser to handle clicking the links the way it normally would. We want to prevent that default behavior, and prevent default will do that when we pass in this event object here. So we'll prevent default, and then just like before, we're going to increment the current image, and then we're going to check once again if the current image happens to be greater than the length of the array that we've got, -1. So again, this could be a 4 here. but instead of a 4, we're putting myphotos.length -1. If that's true, we're going to set current image back to 0. So that part's exactly the same as we did before. And really, this part is only different because we're using the event listener instead. So let's go ahead and put this in. So I have my next button here, which is already going and getting that element. So now I can just do next btn.addEventListener, and I'm listening for a click. That's what I'm listening for. And when the click happens, I'm going to run a function. And I'm going to pass into that function the event object. I put a semicolon at the end of this line. So this function is going to run when the click happens. And then I'm going to click inside here, and I'm going to add something like event.preventDefault. So that'll prevent the default behavior so that when I click on this link, I don't actually get the hashtag coming up in the browser. And that's kind of nice to not have that show up. So it just prevents sort of even trying to go to this href at all. And that's great. And then what we're going to do is we're going to increment current image plus plus, same as we did before. And just like we did before, if current image is greater than myphotos.length -1. So really a 4. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. If it's greater than 4, my photo's length would be 5. But I want to check to see if it's greater than 4. If it's greater than 4, then what I want to do is I want to move it back to current image equals 0. So I will put it back to where it was initially. And again, you could put this on a separate line here. I kind of like it organized this way because it's all just on one line there. There we go. So now current image is going to increment, and it's going to go up, and it's going to become either, it's going to go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and then back to 0.
そこは分かってるか。いよいよ。クロスペイドどうするか。
Here's the new part. Instead of just swapping the source attribute, which is what we did in the first slide, in this one, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new image element, document create element img. So that makes a new image tag. I'm going to put it into this variable called new slide. And then I'm going to set the source, new slide src, to slides/myphotos current image. Notice the use of the tick marks here. And the $ curly brace is going to hold the variable for the myphotos thing. Okay, so that's going to go get the next slides folder. And then I'm going to also add a class name, fade_in_image. And you'll remember we just added that class to the CSS. So we know what that does. When we add that class, it runs that animation over 2 seconds of actually fading in the image. And then we append the child to the slide. So the new slide gets appended to the container. It gets appended with this source and this class. As soon as it gets appended to the container, that animation runs and changes the opacity from 0. It starts at 0 and it goes to 1, which means it's going to go from completely transparent to completely opaque. And because we're adding it into this container, and the CSS for that container is to make these images position absolute, it's going to get put right on top of the previous image.
やってみよう。つまり、でも、フェードイメージ、インデックス。これは一応下に入れたやつだな。コンテナ。コンスト。ニュースライドイコールドキュメント。クリエイトエレメント。クリエイトエレメントの EMG で、ニュースライド SRC コール。スライズ、スラッシュ、プラス、マイフォトズ、インデックス。で、ニュースライダー。ニュースライド点、クラスネーム、コール。フェード、イン、イメージ。コンテナー。それをコンテナに、アペンドチャイルドの子供として追加すると。そうすると、NEXT バトン、アッドイベントリスナー、クリック、コンマ、E 点、エリベントデフォルト。まあ、これクリックした時にやとして、えーっと、エントイメージプラスプラスプラスの if カレントイメージダイナリイコール10レングスカレントイメージイコール0のフェードインフェードインイメージのカレント OK。これで、オープンプレビューのこれをエクスプローラーのテクスト。フェードインにもいかね待って、フェードイン、フェードインイメージが、スライドショー、クロスフェード、スタイルズ、クラスネーム、フェードイメージ、スクリプト、フェードインイメージ。要素、要素、インスペクティブ。言ってる言ってる言ってる。フェードイメージが追加されてる。 でクラスイコールフェードイメージだから言ってるんだな。そうすると、あとは、リムーブチャイルドを作ってるか。
get put right on top of the previous image. And because
さて、外部サーバーで、外部サーバーの方では、クリアダメになってる。うん、ダメだな。じゃあもう一回。チャイルドの追加は、外して、追加をする。フェードイメージがおかしいのかな、そうすると。インデックスで CSS、スタイルズ CS。スタイルズ CSS のピリオドフェードイメージ。フェードイメージ。2BS になってる。2スラス2秒だ。OK。じゃあ、それで表示をすると、おや、ダメだ。2S。
put right on top of the previous image. And because it's the same size as the previous image, it will completely cover it. But because it comes in as trans
もう、イメージ線。13度のスクリプトです。フェードインイメージ。うん。OK。じゃあ、もう一回テナ、オープンウィッツライブさ。うん。うまくいった。あとはプレップだな。じゃあ、とりあえず、こっちのスライドに、
transparent, you'll see the other image underneath it at first, and then over 2 seconds, it'll become opaque. And and that's what will cause the fade in effect. So let's go ahead and add this to our code over here. Var new slide. And I'm going to set that to document.createElement. And what am I going to create? I'm going to create an image, img. So there we go. So now we've got a variable that's holding a new image element. The image element is not on the page, but it's there. And then I'm going to say new slide dot class name equals fade in img. Make sure you spell it right. It needs to, needs to match exactly what you have here, fade in image. Those two things need to match. Doesn't matter if you spelled it differently from how I did, as long as this one matches, as long as they're the same as each other, and then that's fine. So we're going to add that on there. Oh, I also forgot. I'm going to do new slide. SRC. I'm going to set its source to. I'm going to use my tick marks here. Tick, tick. And in here, I'm going to say, okay, slides, because I'm in a folder called slides over here. I need to go to slides, and then I need to do slash, and I would put image 1 or image 2 or image 3, but instead I'm going to put a variable there. So again, we do the $sign and the curly braces so we can do a variable. And what variable do we want? We want my photos, square brackets, current image. That current image right there. Current image. So when we click the next button the first time, it starts off at 0. When we click it the first time, it gets incremented to 1. So when that gets incremented to 1, a new photo gets created, and the source gets set to, this gets incremented to 1, so the source gets set to image 2, and that goes in there. So it's slide slash, that'll be an image2.jpg the first time you click it. The next time you click it, it'll be an image 3. And when you get to image 5, if you click it again, that gets beyond the length here, so it gets set back to 0, so it'll go back to 1. Now the last thing we need to do here is append this to the container. And we created a variable here for the container. So we can say dot append child new slide. So it'll take that new slide that we created here as an image, set the source, set the class, and put it on in there. Put it on the page. Let's save this and see if I did it right. I'm going to go over to my slideshow here, click refresh, and then click next. And look at that, it's working. It's working just perfectly. Next. And I can see in here that it's adding the images one on top of the other. It put 3 on top of 2. It put 4 on top of 3. It put 5 on top of 4. And now it'll put 1 on top of 5. And you'll see as you're adding them, that animation is taking place. And over 2 seconds, the picture comes in as transparent. And then over 2 seconds, it fades to opaque. And that's what's creating that crossfade effect.
Remove child. で、同じように、グレープバトン、アットイベントリスナー、クリック。アクション。My photos, things, マイナス。そして、フェードインイメージの かれん。これで、ハテナで、エクスプローラーで入れて、やっぱリオミサイルでダメなのか。うーん。うん。げー。うまくいきましたね。じゃあ、大丈夫。
As you just saw, this is working, and the images are coming in and they're stacking one on top of the other and fading in. But there's one thing that we can do to make this a little bit better. I don't really like that every time I click the link, it's adding more images to the DOM, especially when it starts adding the same images to the DOM over and over and over again. I think that it could be a little bit more efficient and a little bit better and a little bit cleaner.
イメージはしたけど、積み重なって
So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the extra ones, the extra images as the new images come in. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, container, you have children. The children of the container are the images.
ああ、多分、チルドレンレングスで選べばいいのか。
And if I have more than two images, if
つまり、これ全部プロイメージのところに入ってるから、if コンテナチルドレンレングス大なりゴールにコンテナリムーブチャイルドコンテナチルドレン大括弧0こうか。
if children.length is greater than 2, I'm going to remove the first one in that container, the bottom image. I'm going to remove the one from the very bottom of that list, which is not showing anyway. It's at the bottom of the stack and it's not going to be seen anyway. So that means you'll have one image and then you'll put another image on top. And as soon as you click next and add a third image, then the one at the very bottom of the list will go away. So that you never have more than 2 in the list. And I think that that makes the script a little bit better, keeps our DOM a little bit cleaner because we're not continuing to add more and more elements every time somebody clicks the link for next. So let's go ahead and add this to our script over here. So down here, I'm going to say if, and in here I'm going to just put container dot children dot length. If that's greater than 2, then I want to do something. And what do I want to do if it's greater than 2? What I want to do is I want to say container dot remove child. I want to remove a child. Which child do I want to remove? I want to do container.children. That'll be all of them, but I want to get square brackets 0. That will remove the bottommost child from the list. And we're using the remove child method, which is a document method that allows us to go into the document and remove a child from a particular element, in this case, the container. And again, up here, the container is this thing, this div, and it has children, which are images. And this, when we start off the page, there's just one. But as we've been clicking the link, it adds more and more and more and more in there. And we really don't want that to happen. So this will keep us from adding more than 2, because once we get more than 2, it'll remove the bottom one from the list. Let's save this and see if I typed it all right and test it over here. And I'm going to look at my content here. You can see I've got one image there. I add one. So that adds image number 2 on there. And then now if I click it again, whoops, image number 3, what did I do wrong over here? And this happens. You'll notice over here I've got errors. So what did I do wrong? Let's go to the console and see. Oh, container is not defined. So this is a perfect example of a type of error that might come up, will probably come up if you spell something wrong. And it says over here on line 39, container. Line 39, container. Container. There we go. Let's try that. Come back here. We all make misspellings. We all make mistakes. Don't expect to not make mistakes. It's great when those come up while I'm doing this, because then you get to see how I fix it. All right, so coming in here, I can click next, and it's adding that on there. You'll notice I'm not getting the error now. And now when I click the third one, it should add the third image, but also remove the first one at the bottom there, or really at the top of this list. But really this one is underneath that one. So that's what I mean by bottom. So now we've added image 3, but image 1 went away. And I can keep going. It'll do image 4 on top of there, and then image 5. We've got 4 and 5 on the screen. 4 is on the bottom, 5 is on the top.
うちの場合どうなってるかな。インスペクターして、あ、消えてる。そっか、あそこで消しちゃってるからか。だからこれは、フェードインイメージの大なりイコール、2枚の時をこれに増やして、3枚になった場合だから。これでよし。こういうこと、ここ2枚イメージがついて、3、4、5、エビアス、next, OK.
And image 1 is now on the top. You might be wondering why the one down here at the bottom is on the top. You have to remember the page renders from the top to the bottom. And the fact that these are set to position absolute means that this one gets added to the page first, and then this one gets added to the page second. And because it gets added to the page second, and because of the absolute positioning, that means it ends up on top. It's on top of the first image.
重なってるからこういう
That's
ふうに
working
でき
just
るわ
great.
けね。
Exactly what we want.
Idea true statement about the relationship between images and JavaScript and scenes. With an understanding of how positioning works in this script will be difficult. Yes. Doing animation handled by this is more efficient than creating the same animation in JavaScript. Okay. JavaScript can do everything images can. 違う。お助けだな。と。じゃあ次。
We have our next button working just fine. So I can click next, and it will go through the slides. And not only that, but it's kind of nice and clean because it removes any extra slides you don't need as it's adding new slides on top. So that's really neat, and that's working. So now the question is, how do we get the previous button to work? Because currently clicking that does nothing but reset the page, and notice we're getting the hashtag up here. So how do we get the previous button to work? What we want to do is pretty much the same thing that we did with the next button, but with the previous button. See if you can do that challenge on your own. And you can even go ahead and take this function that we've written for the next button here, this one here, copy and paste it, and see what you need to change to make it work for the previous button. And just like before, you can actually use the previous slideshow, the previous project, the earlier version of the slideshow, to figure out how to do this, because we're going to decrement the image, and this is going to change. But all of this is going to remain exactly the same. So see if you can do it on your own. Pause this video and come back when you've tried it, and either you've gotten it to work or you haven't gotten it to work. Now, even if you don't get it to work, that's okay. Try to do it on your own. Did you get something like this? Hopefully you did. Let's take a look at what's changed here. What's changed is here, we're putting the event listener on the previous button instead of the next button. So that's different. The rest of this is all the same. Instead of incrementing current image, we're decrementing it. So that's different. And then down here, the if statement has changed a little bit. If the current image is less than 0, we're setting current image to photos length -1, just like we did in the previous slideshow. So other than that, everything else is the same. So let's see if we can actually make this work. Over here, I'm going to copy this script and then paste it here and just change this to btn, which is what I have up here, prev btn. So that's going to go into the DOM and get that button and add the event listener to it, and all this stuff is the same. The only thing that's different is here. This gets decremented. And then down here, if this is less than 0, then we're going to set current image to myphotos.length -1. Okay, so that's going to set that all up there to work for the current image for that one. And that should be it. That's all we need. The rest is going to be the same. We're still going to create an image. We're still going to go get the image from the array based on the value of current image here.
Yeah,
and then we're still going to apply that class to it, and we're going to still put it on the page. And we're still going to remove the extra children. So all the rest should be the same. Let's see if this works. If we come back and click refresh, next works. I can add images, and over here you can see they're getting added. Image 2, image 3, I could add one more, image 4. And now when I click previous, you can see image 3 got put on top and image 4 is now on the bottom. Image 2 is now on top, image 3 is on the bottom, image 1, and then image 5, because we're going to the end of the array. And then back on down through the array like that. So that's working perfectly, just exactly what we want.
ここまではできた。さあ、次。
Your script is working great, and you could just leave it the way it is. It's totally fine. But you'll notice that we have a fair amount of duplicate code. If we go over and look at our script, we've got this chunk of code in here. That's a good, several lines of code, which is exactly the same as this chunk of code up here. And there's a concept in programming called don't repeat yourself, dry, don't repeat yourself. So what we want to do is, instead of repeat this code twice, pull it out and put it into a separate function. We're going to make a function called swap image, something like that. And that function is going to have this chunk of code in it. And then instead of having this chunk of code here in each of these event listeners, we can just run that function twice, once in the next button event listener function and one in the previous event listener button function. So try to do that on your own. See if you can pull that code out, put it in a separate function, and give that function a name, and then call that function here inside these functions. And see if you can do that on your own. Pause this video now and try it. And if you can't figure it out, or once you do figure it out, continue with the video to see if you got the same thing that I got. Did you get something like this? I hope you did. You may have named it something slightly different, and that's fine. But this is what I named it, swap image. And down here I have a swap image function. Let's do this together, just in case you got stuck. And you can see how I would go about doing this. So down here, I'm going to make a new function. Function swap image. And then that function is going to contain all of this stuff in here. So I can cut that and stick it inside this function. There we go. And now, instead of having that up there, I can just run swap image right here. I can also run it here in place of this stuff because it's all exactly the same. There we go. So now we've got a function called swap image that will run twice. It'll run the same function basically if you're clicking the next button or the previous button. And that kind of cleans up our code because we can see here very clearly that the next button is incrementing this variable and then checking with an if statement and then running function. And we can come down here and we can see what that function does very easily without any fuss or muss. So that kind of really cleans up the code a bit. Let's test it and make sure we did it right. So over here, I'm going to refresh the page. If I click next, you can see that the script is working exactly the same as it did before. Nothing else has changed really. We're not adding any new functionality. We're just refactoring our code. You always want to refactor your code and try to make it better and try to reduce the amount of code or make it cleaner or make it easier to read. All of these things you want to do. And often when you're working on projects, you'll find ways, you'll look at an old piece of code and you go, oh, wow, I could have made that simpler. And you'll do that. And that's just part of the normal process for any programmer. Now, the very last thing to do here is to put it in a separate linked file and to do all of our nice cleanup stuff to follow best practices for scope and for everything else. So let's do that quickly together as well. So I'm going to come back to my file over here. I'm going to make a new file on here. Click new file here and call it script.js. And look at that, I made a mistake because I can see it's putting it inside my slides folder, which is not where I want it. So I'm going to actually move that out here. Are you sure you want to move? Yes, move. So now it's here. So make sure it's not inside the slides folder. It's here, script.js. And you could put it inside the slides folder and link it there. It just doesn't really make a lot of logical sense to put it in there. Okay, so on the script file, once again, I'm going to add my immediately invoked function, parentheses, curly braces, and then an additional set of parentheses and a semicolon. It's terrible syntax, but that's what we do here. This function will run immediately when the page runs. And then click between the curly braces and move that down. And we're going to add use strict in here. So that's great. So we've got use strict in there. And now we can come over here to grab our script from here. We're just going to grab everything inside our script tags all the way up to the very top.
スクリプトの中を全部コピーして、
I'm going to copy that and I'm going to stick it over here and paste it in there.
ただ、バーを使うのは良くないね。
Shift tab to move it back. So now that's in there. That's good. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to go through and fix the variables here. This one, current image, is going to change. That variable is going to change down here. We can see that. So that needs to be let. But the rest of these can all be const, because those aren't going to change during the script at all, during the running of the script. And then down in the swap image, we have a variable here. That one can also be const. Great, so we've got that. So now we've got our file all set, and that's all looking good. Over here on our index file, we just need to get rid of that stuff and put in here src equals script.js. That's our file. And we can put this up here like so. We could leave it like that, or even better, we could take this and move it up here into the head of the page and add the defer attribute here. Save that, and then always check to make sure you didn't mess things up along the way. And look at that, it's working perfectly. Everything works great. So there we go. We have finished our script and we've cleaned it all up. And in this lesson, you've learned a lot about some different ways of doing things and how to add elements to the page and remove them from the page, all with using our document object model as well as our event handlers. And this is a really great little slideshow that you could use on any web page. And yeah, I think this is a great project.
ここまではやったし。で、開始と。このように書いていいだけだね。で、関数のプロンプト。モジュール探し。要するにクイズ。ギリギリ間に合いそうやな。Identify true statements concerning JavaScript and DOM 成功だった場合。JavaScript と DOM の操作について正しいものをすべてチェックせよ。JavaScript only recently developed features focusing elements on web page. 違う。Just sees the web page as just string object. 違う。This includes the number of documents, methods, and properties that allow developers to access content within DOM and manipulate it. Yes. Just sees the web page as the tree of branches its nodes. Yes. Some elements on web page cannot be accessed in private, so they should be avoided. そのことはない。Does it recognize the parts-child relationship between various elements on the web page? Yes. What is the dot or period character used in JavaScript to signify the end of a logical statement? To separate an object from its properties? Yes. To concatenate one statement to the next? 違う。To separate program from itsメソッドとプロパティだけなんだよな、確か。To signify classes。この場合のクラスイズは入れていいんじゃないかな。CSS のクラスは入れるんだよね。入れなくていいや。Select all the true statements about properties and methods。プロパティーズメソッドについて正しいものを選べ。Document property include parent name of enabled property name。 Methods have parentness and sometimes parameters are passed into the parentness. Document properties and methods to the same things and are in そんなことはない。Properties are distinguished by the dot and then follow with the equal sign and then a value. Yes. Methods only work when the component is event handled. そんなことはない。Ideally, the document methods are not return an array of elements. If only one element of zero elements are in E. アレイと申すものを入れる。クエリセレクト。タグネーム、セレクト。この3つか。相手 all the events properties select on mouse over, on submit, on click と。Identify all the true statements about the event methods. セレクト。イベントメソッドに親しいものすべて選べ。You can remove an event listener with the remove event listener method. Yes. Event listener is a commonly used event method. Yes. Event method can be attached to the elements, the document, or even the windows. Yes. You have to initialize the event module interface before using it. そんなことはできない。Event methods can only be accessed through a computer and not mobile device. そんなことはない。You can only attach one event method. そんなことはない。アクティブにスタックする。Identify the problem with the event handler below the selected order. By my button in document gallery selected button. My button will add click function event. Print. これだね。プロブレムス。my button。ウィックだから合ってる。ファンクションイベント。イベントプリントやる。アラート一発。これだけだもん。What was the anonymous function frequency used with the select order? So, because these functions are usually only used if context of an event and rarely used elsewhere in the program. Yes. Most event handlers will only work with anonymous functions. If you create a new variable inside the function and forgot to use the var keyword, that does JavaScript do. Yes. まずはこれやな。What does the use segregate variable declaration and will throw an error if there is a variable declared with the function usable keyword with a let const. これだね。With the addition of the let keyword, how many different scopes does JavaScript const? JavaScript has two levels of scope. Look. The let keyword does the same things as 違う。So JavaScript has written to be a simple it's only global scope. 違う。JavaScript has global, the window, and the local. 違う。ではどうしてください。これだな。Which of the following statements are true about this posting in JavaScript set to apply? どの、この正しいものを選ぶか。どうして俺がan issue problem あるの If you define a variable using a console, it will not be hoisted. ん ホイスティング、なんだ。巻き上げ、そういうことね。just based on where the scripts file they are defined. Keyword let hoisting. If you define a variable using a constant let keyword, it will not be hoisted. Also, the message can cause problems because it possible for program to toss the value before the variable has the value assigned to it. だから、to be not hoisted. I didn't have the errors in the cat's code below. コンストカウンターイコール。コンストは無理やん。よし。シンと。95.64。僕間違えた。あれ一つ抜けてたか。それ以外は正敵の項目に進む JavaScript コンピューターグが。というわけで、返信とかやっといて。なんとか、3週目終わったかな。完了ですね。ということで、この3週目が終わったので、今回はここまでにします。ではでは。ビデオを、ではありがとうございました。ビデオ終了。
ディスコンネクト。